Hi, let's think about how transitions might be useful in your literary analysis essays. One of your most important jobs as a writer is to help your audience and create guideposts that show them what you're trying to do. You don't want to assume that your audience can tell what the connection is between your ideas. So you as a writer have to consciously make that explicit to the audience. One of the best and the easiest ways to do this, to make those connections, is to use what are called transitions. And these can be used to connect sentences within paragraphs, but I tend to think that they're most helpful in connecting paragraphs together and showing the relationship between a paragraph and the one that comes before it. So these keywords come out and tell your audience, here's what I'm trying to do. So in order to use these things, you obviously need to know what it is that you're trying to do. So I always recommend, before sitting down and starting to type your essay, maybe take some time and envision what you're trying to do in each paragraph, because that's going to tell you what might be the best order to present these ideas, what sorts of details need to be included, and also where you might need some transitions to make the writing flow a little bit more smoothly. And again, the idea is that when you don't include transitions, writing can sound kind of disconnected. You know, the paper might sound like a bunch of random paragraphs that show no relationship with each other. You want the essay to sound like it's one cohesive piece of writing that's all centered on a single focus or topic, right? So these transitions are really important words, but if you use them well, the reader should notice them, but focus more on what follows them. So probably the best analogy I've ever heard is that transitions are like turn signals. So think about when you're driving down the road in your car. When you're driving and you see a car in front of you and someone puts the left turn signal on, it's something that you're going to notice and respond to. Like that's your signal to put the brake on slowly, hopefully. But again, it's not something that's going to take up a lot of your mental energy, right? So if I'm driving and I see somebody with the turn signal on, I can still be playing with the radio, I can be drinking my coffee, I can be thinking about what I'm going to eat for dinner tonight. But again, I'm going to respond to that turn signal pretty much automatically. It's sort of like second nature because I know what the turn signals mean. This is the way that transitions work, right? A transition should be a word or phrase that an audience is familiar with and that they know automatically, oh, here's what's going to follow, right? Or here's what the writer's trying to do. But again, they're going to focus more on what follows these transitions and be thinking about, you know, the point you're trying to make or the evidence that you're using. But those transitions are really helpful in just kind of reminding the audience, oh, here's what you should be seeing about these ideas. Here's the connection between them. So they end up being really helpful. So overwhelmingly, the use of transitions is a good thing, but you want to make sure that you're using the right transitions for what you're trying to do. A lot of times I'll see students who've written papers and you can tell they know they're supposed to be using transitions every once in a while, but they end up using sort of the same few transitions that don't always work in every case. Like a common one that I see for whatever reason is the transition moreover. Moreover is a good transition to use, but it doesn't make sense in every single circumstance. So to illustrate this, I included some sentences here at the top of this page. So I want to look at these pairs of sentences and think about why the transition that I've underlined doesn't really work for this specific situation. So let's look at the top pairing. Exercise is really good for one's physical and mental health. Furthermore, when taken to an extreme, exercise can cause damage to one's body. So furthermore is a transition, but it doesn't work in the situation we have here. When you see the transition furthermore, that tells an audience, I'm going to be extending an idea I was just talking about. I'm going to be moving in a similar direction and giving you more information. That's not what's going on in this pairing. In the top sentence, it's giving a couple benefits of exercise, but the second sentence is going in a different direction and saying when exercise can be dangerous. They don't fit together, right? So I would want to use a transition that shows opposition or contradiction, right? Maybe I'd use something like yet, or on the other hand. These signals to the audience, I'm about to tell you something different than I was just talking about, right? So something else would work better in this situation. Let's look at the middle two. People don't realize the many activities that count as exercise. Consequently, an activity like cleaning your house can be a great way to stay fit. Again, here's an example of something that can be a good transition. It's just not in the scenario we have here. That transition consequently has to do with like a cause and effect relationship, right? When we say consequently, we're talking about the effect of something or the result, right? That's not what is being implied here. The first sentence is saying there are all these activities that count as exercise, and really what this next sentence is doing is giving an example, right? Here's one example of an activity, cleaning your house, that counts as exercise. So we'd want to use a transition that shows you're trying to give an example. It could be something like, for instance, or to illustrate, or even for example, that is more appropriate for what the sentence is trying to do. Let's look at the one at the, middle, but technically the last one here. This final point is the one that people have the hardest time accepting. Changing your body takes time. Next, as has been discussed throughout the essay, it's important that people make physical fitness a priority in their lives. When you use the transition next, the audience expects that, this is kind of in the middle of a series of things, right? It's kind of continuing on from what was discussed before, and it's going to be followed by probably at least a couple more points, right? We have clues in both the top and bottom sentence that that's not really the case here, right? We have these clues like this final point, and then in the second sentence, as has been discussed throughout the essay. Those are both common clues that the writer's trying to conclude, right? Or shut down some discussion. So if that's the case, next is not really appropriate here, right? Next implies that you're going to continue on. Whereas if you're concluding, you'd want to use a transition like overall or in the end or even in conclusion. I can't tell you how many times I've read students' essays and they'll use that transition in conclusion, but then, go on for 3 more paragraphs. Again, it's not appropriate to use that unless you're really about to conclude the essay. So again, even though I think that it's a much bigger problem when you don't have any transitions in your writing, you want to be careful not to use inappropriate transitions, but also don't overuse them either. I don't think that you need to have a transition in every sentence or even at the beginning of every paragraph. But every once in a while, it's good to use them whenever you think the audience might need a little extra direction or guidance, right? So how does this relate to your literary analysis essays that you're working on here? I wrote a couple of paragraphs using the same example from the previous video, this Road Not Taken poem by Robert Frost that you guys read. So again, I tried to underline transitions that I used. I want you to think about, how these words and phrases are trying to help show what I'm doing here, right? So let's look at the first paragraph. In Frost's poem, he expresses the anxiety that people often feel about making the wrong choices in life, and he does this through language evoking regret rather than contentment about choosing a path. Many people have interpreted the meaning of Frost's poem as being an endorsement for taking the road, quote, less traveled by, since it seems to have, quote, made all the difference to the speaker of the poem. However, upon closer reading of the poem, we're given hints that this speaker is not so certain about the choice he has made. For one thing, it seems significant that the poem is titled The Road Not Taken, not The Road I Took. It's as though the speaker is more curious or even haunted by the path or life that he could have, rather than feeling grateful for the road he did take. Additionally, Frost mentions several phrases showing that he anticipates regretting the choices he made. Quote, sorry I could not travel both. Quote, I doubted if I should ever come back. Quote, I shall be telling this with a sigh. Rather than expressing satisfaction or conviction about his choice, such language implies that the speaker doesn't necessarily believe that he made a bad decision, but he worries that in the future he will. Ultimately, Frost seems to represent a common feeling that many people have, concerned that a single choice could determine one's happiness for the rest of their lives. So notice how I consciously tried to include transitions in the paragraph. And again, maybe this is too many for one paragraph, but just by seeing a word like however, the audience is going to know, I'm taking a different perspective than what I was just talking about. Or if I use for one thing, I'm trying to give an example of evidence, right? So again, using these every once in a while might be helpful in conveying what you're trying to do, right? So in the second paragraph, I used a transition at the beginning to try to connect paragraph 1 to paragraph 2. And again, I'm trying to show that I'm moving in a similar direction, but I'm going to be talking about a new example, right? So I use this transition not only, but also. Not only does Frost raise this theme of anguish over decision making, but also he suggests that perhaps we place too much importance on individual choices and that these things don't matter as much in the long run as we believe that they do. So again, this not only but also shows that, I just gave an example of how, Frost's poem is talking about worry over decisions, but now I'm going to add in this new element that not only that maybe decision making doesn't matter that much. So again, if I didn't have that, the audience might not understand that these two ideas are connected, that one's kind of extending the idea of the other, right? By emphasizing the image of these two diverging roads, it would seem that Frost wants to accentuate the difference between them. On the other hand, again, just by using that phrase, I'm showing here's what some people might think, but here's a different way that I think about it, right? On the other hand, throughout the poem, there are several instances in which the similarity of the paths is evident. He describes one path as being, quote, just as fair as the other, says that both paths, quote, that morning equally lay, and even though he decides to choose the path least worn down, the speaker concedes that foot traffic had, quote, worn them really about the same. By expressing the sameness between the paths rather than some huge difference between them, the reader is meant to see that the speaker's worry about making the wrong choice is rather unnecessary. As can be seen, and again, this is like a common transition that you see when people are concluding or summing up, right? As can be seen, whereas the common interpretation of the poem applauds the speaker for making the right decision that brings him fulfillment, closer examination of the text implies that this choice between the two paths may not make much of a difference in the speaker's life at all. He only worries that it will, and Frost emphasizes that such anxiety is perhaps a waste of time. So as you begin working on your literary analysis drafts, be thinking about how you might help out your audience and help them see connections between your ideas by consciously using transitions that help them to recognize what your purpose actually is.